Pues buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Qué bueno verlos aquí el último día de clase. Muchas gracias, doctora Jenkins, por estar aquí con nosotros. Y bueno, estamos aquí para presenciar la conferencia de la doctora Janice Jenkins, que está dentro del marco de los 30 años del posgrado de COLED. Y bueno, también esta visita ha sido posible gracias a las gestiones de la doctora Olga Odgers y de la doctora Olga Oliva, lo cual quiero pues agradecer y me da mucho gusto que podamos hacer este tipo de colaboraciones, porque pues, recordemos que la maestría es un grupo de personas, no solamente una persona, ¿no? En este caso, yo como coordinadora trabajo pues con toda la planta núcleo, y me ha dado mucho gusto trabajar con Olga, que nos ha apoyado en 2 ocasiones y bueno, nos apoya constantemente, también dando clases y otras cosas, y con Olga Olivas, que tampoco no habíamos trabajado, pero que estamos trabajando ahora con ella, y que muchas gracias. Le voy a dar la palabra a Olga Olivas, quien va a presentar a la doctora Janice, y bueno, después proseguiremos a que inicie la conferencia para darle el mayor tiempo posible a la discusión y a la exposición de la doctora. Gracias.
Bueno, pues buenos días. Muchas gracias primero a la doctora Janice Jenkins por aceptar esta invitación y por venir a compartir un trabajo que está reciente, en 5 días por salir publicado, así que vamos a recibir como noticias muy frescas, ¿no? Como de este trabajo que ya encontraremos en 5 días en un libro. Y bueno, la doctora Janice Jenkins es antropóloga, especializada en el área de antropología médica, psicológica. Recibió su doctorado en la UCLA y la formación postdoctoral en la Escuela de Medicina de Harvard. Ha sido profesora en la Facultad de Universidad de Harvard y la Universidad de Case Western Reserve y la UCSD. La profesora Jenkins es una destacada estudiosa internacionalmente dentro del campo de la cultura y la salud mental. Ella es miembro permanente del Institute for Advanced Studies en Princeton, New Jersey, y durante su estancia académica del 2011-2012. También ha sido nombrada miembro de la actual Sociedad de los Estados Unidos en la Sociedad Filosófica Americana. En 2002 fue profesora visitante en el Departamento de Salud y Ciencias Humanas, Instituto de Medicina Social, Universidad de Estado de Río de Janeiro. La Fundación Russell Sage la designó como visitante escolar residente en la ciudad de Nueva York de 1996 al 97, y en el Instituto Nacional de Salud Mental la doctora Jenkins ha estado activa como miembro de 3 grupos diferentes de revisión científica desde el 93 al 2005. También ha sido elegida presidente de la Asociación de Profesores de la Mujer del 91 al 93 y nombrada directora de estudios de la mujer de la Universidad de Case Western Reserve del 94 al 2000. En la Escuela de Medicina de Harvard fue nombrada investigadora, instructora y jefe preceptor en los departamentos de Medicina Social, Antropología y Psiquiatría del 86 al 90, y del 84 al 86 fue asistente de investigación de Antropología en la Facultad de UCLA en el Departamento de Psiquiatría y Ciencias del Comportamiento, y más recientemente fue galardonada como visitante distinguido en la Facultad de Becas de la Universidad de Monash en Melbourne, Australia, en el verano del 2013. Y bueno, actualmente se encuentra aquí muy cerca, en la UCSD, del otro lado de la frontera, y bueno, queremos pues también compartir que la doctora Jenkins ha estado colaborando en un proyecto coordinado por la doctora Olga Odgers sobre los centros evangélicos de rehabilitación, y le quisiera dar la palabra para si nos puede dar un poquito de esa referencia.
Muy rápidamente, porque si no no vamos a dejar hablar a Janice. La doctora Jenkins va a hablar en inglés. Le vamos a pedir por favor que trate de hacerlo lo más despacio posible. Si tienen dudas, si tienen preguntas, si hay alguna idea en el camino que crean que requiere que se explique, por favor, levanten la mano, háganlo en el momento para estar seguros de que van siguiendo la conferencia. De todas maneras, Janice va a intervenir por aproximadamente unos 45, 50 minutos para tener tiempo después para los comentarios. Entonces, nada más, insisto, en el momento en el que consideren que es necesario alguna aclaración o alguna precisión, váyanlo haciendo para que no se pierdan. ¿Sí?
Bueno, muy amable, muchas gracias. Es un gran placer para mí estar aquí con ustedes y muchas gracias a Olga Yola. Es la segunda vez que estoy aquí en Colep y disculpe porque voy a hablar en inglés. La vergüenza es mía, pero eso es. Es tan difícil para mí cambiar porque no es una idea buena. Entonces, I'm going to talk about a book that I just finished writing, like, as Olga says, 5 days ago. So, la cantidad de cafeína y otras es como, no se puede imaginar. Es de mi familia, ellos quieren matarme, el proceso de finish a book es un proceso de locura, eso es, pero ojalá que no totalmente. What I want to do is talk to you. I understand that many of you are students of cultural studies. Okay, so I was being polite. Every single one of you is. Well, in cultural studies and in anthropology, even though I am an anthropologist, and by the way, culture is ours. So I want to talk to you guys. We're going to have a long talk. So cultural studies and anthropology I'm going to argue the case for the importance of paying attention to extraordinary conditions, to include many things, including mental illness, as not something over there that's just abstract or we don't really need to think about if we are thinking about culture. So I will, as I have been asked, try to speak slowly, and that's not really too hard because I get complaints sometimes that I speak too slowly anyway. So let's see. Oh, this thing is up here. It took me so long to get this. I'm making this into a PowerPoint because it's the book jacket that the University of California finally put together. That was one of the hardest parts of getting this thing done. So you get to see what it will look like. The book is in production. So let me start. This book that I'm going to talk to you about, the introduction to this, but let me see. Okay, this is the contents of the book. A couple of different. Chapter 3 disappeared. That's it's a ghost. I can tell you what it is. I even know what it is. But conceptions of this is what happens when you make PowerPoints like this, like I did last night at 10:30 at night. Okay. Anyway, the first chapter, Cultural Chemistry in the Clozapine Clinic, is an ethnography of a clinic that was the first to treat people diagnosed with schizophrenia with a new wonder drug, clozapine. And it was the first one that opened in the United States, even though they had it in France before. It's a complicated ethnographic story. The second one, this is how God wants it, the struggle of Sebastián. That is a life history of a young man that I got to know early on in my research project. He was from Los Angeles. he was born in Juarez, but he lived in LA, and he had the process of coming to grips with very difficult subjectivity of hearing voices and ultimately deciding that it was the voice of God. This went on over the period of 2 years that I had conversations with him. That's that one chapter. The third mystery chapter is on family conceptions of problems that get diagnosed as mental illness, as problems nervios, for the Mexican immigrants that I worked with. That was the most common way of thinking about it, and that was in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Or the Anglos or the Euro-Americans that thought of it as problems of character, like laziness or, just being a bad person. So these differences. And then the family's emotional response to the problem. And as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, why do we care about that? Because it makes a difference not only for everyday life, but also for who gets better and who didn't. And these studies that we did in LA, we found that the Mexican descent persons did much better. They recovered more quickly. They were sick also initially in a similar way, but they got better. So we were interested in the cultural processes that make a difference for who gets better. Chapter 4, this is from my work with Salvadoran refugees that was done in Boston, as a matter of fact. Everyone knows the Civil War, funded by the United States government, let's not get started, that they came to the clinic we had in Boston, the Latino mental health clinic, and I got to know many of these Salvadorans, particularly women, and it's a chapter about them. And the same thing for chapter 5, Blood and Magic, no hay que creer ni dejar de creer. And that's the complicated meaning in terms of how that works in their lives, in terms of mental health and religion. That is a chapter on religion and mental health, the Blood and Magic. And then the final one is from our more recent work, and all of this work that I'm talking to you about, even though I'm using the first person I, it's all collaborative. It's all been done with other social scientists, other professors, many graduate students. I like to, don't be afraid. I like to take all you guys, and we like big projects with lots of students involved to collect field work, to help with the analysis, to learn and to get trained. All of these projects have been done in this way. This chapter 6 is on our work in New Mexico, where child poverty and poverty in terms of the whole country of the U.S. is one of the worst in the state of New Mexico. And people have this idea about Santa Fe, so beautiful. It's a very rural state and very impoverished and lots of trouble. And I talk about these adolescents who were hospitalized in Albuquerque for problems that get diagnosed as psychiatric disorder, but really it is a problem of structural violence. There's a problem of poverty, discrimination, institutional neglect, lots of problems. So let me, I don't even know, oh yes, I do know what's coming next. So the book is an anthropological appraisal of life on the edge of experience. And it is based on these studies that I've done over the course of 3 decades. And in doing that work, I have come to think that it is a very useful methodological approach to think through extraordinary conditions, I'll say more about that in just one moment, that define this life on the edge. My use of extraordinary conditions presumes a double meaning of both of those words. In the first place, the term conditions presumes in the first place, conditions, I mean illnesses, disorders, or syndromes that are culturally defined as mental illness. Okay. I also mean, in terms of conditions, warfare, political violence, domestic violence and abuse, scarcity and neglect of basic human needs constituted by social situations and forces of adversity. So my notion of this extraordinary emphasizes the non-ordinary and the spectacular, and I use these words instead of obscure or bizarre, because that's a lot of the way that psychiatrists talk about mental illness. It's bizarre, and if you're a field worker and you go in and you expect things to be really strange and bizarre, and then they're not. So that comes out of that experience. The second meaning of the extraordinary, however, recognizes the compelling, impressive, and even heroic quality often evident in life at the edge of experience for both afflicted individuals and their families. Central to the analysis is the primacy of lived experience, not big quantitative data, the primacy of lived experience, not only as a possibility writ large, but as a human capacity for struggle. This is very central in this book, the process of struggle. I have observed this capacity across a range of conditions of extremity, such as unrelenting depression, hearing voices, coming to terms with psychotropic medications, troubled emotional environments in families, flight from warfare, political violence, and children's lives marked by extreme instability, abuse, or inadequacy of care. So, at the heart of this book is the continuation of an argument that I made in an earlier book, that conditions of mental illness must be understood as engaging fundamental human processes, and a short list of these processes that I take it for granted that they are constructed by a kind of intricate melange of culture, biology, and psyche to include self, emotion, cognition, gender, identity, attachment, and meaning. These processes are fluid rather than fixed, and indeed, these are hardly transparent among those who are not afflicted with mental illness, yet examining their modulations, and the analysis is phenomenological in this regard. They're examining the modulations of these processes in extreme cases helps to understand how they work and why they are fundamental. Moreover, I make the argument, as I mentioned, about struggle, and I like thinking about that more than just resilience. We see a lot of studies about resilience. Very important. I am guilty. I have written stuff on that. I think it's important. But I think it's more than that, resilience, because I think it's not, resilience is too individualized of a concept. And I think that you have to get into the bigger structural system. And when we elevate this struggle, this analytic study of struggle, we see that the usual conceptual categories of analysis are become problematic in various ways. So I'm in these various studies that I feel very privileged as an anthropologist to have met so many people and engaged in so many lives, even though to a limited degree. I feel honored that I have been able to enter people's worlds to an extent and have tried my best to learn from that. And what I have seen is this struggle, as I say, even despite subjective conditions of diagnosed as schizophrenia, bipolar, depressive illness, trauma-related, PTSD sometimes, but almost always, and particularly with PTSD, trauma, and with bipolar, and even with schizophrenia, the co-occurring substance abuse. Now I know that there are some really important ethnographic research going on and survey research going on here at COLEF. This is really cutting edge research that's going on here. But I'm sure that in looking at the religious dimensions of treatment for substance abuse, that there are also questions of mental health that factor in there. No? We can talk about that later. So the struggles are really formidable. In being able to get out of bed, everybody's had that, but in being able to get out of bed, if you're really clinically depressed, that is difficult to impossible in some cases. Although not with the Salvadoran women that I worked with that had a more, what I called a kind of engaged depression. I could talk more about that later if we want. But struggles to get out of bed, to confront voices that are tormenting a person, to live with memories of mutilated bodies of loved ones. Superimposed upon these are daily life experiences of socially applied stigma, social stigma that is meted out by the public for being perceived as different. There is this sense of disdain exuded by the store clerk or fellow patrons when we were picking up a medicine at the pharmacy. The sense of exclusion conveyed because one can neither speak nor understand the dominant language. The preoccupying fear that neighbors might call immigration authorities or may undertake practices of witchcraft for which one must seek spiritual protection. What it takes to subsist, let alone prevail, under these conditions cannot be understood without an understanding of struggle. In the book, I provide an argument for understanding struggle foregrounded as a fundamental human process for conditions extraordinary and ordinary alike. Now, in this approach that I have to understanding human phenomenon in this way, I think of it qualitatively as a continuum, not categorically distinct, drawing from the work of French philosopher and physician Georges Canguilhem, and adopting this approach, which I have found very valuable. The theoretical value is, and Foucault did this too, in an emphasis on what arguably can be considered extreme or uncommon experience that defines the further ends of the continuum, in contrast to the more ordinary or common experience. You taking this methodological approach leads to a variety of observations. For example, in examining situations of mental illness, it's clear to me, my view is, that as a matter of lived experience, there is no such thing as individual pathology. These situations are invariably constituted by intersubjectivity, social and economic conditions of possibility and constraint, and the shaping of cultural expectations of persons in relation to gender, mental, and political status. My analysis of these interlocking domains of extraordinary conditions can be summarized precisely by the well-known feminist recognition of the reciprocal relations of the personal and the political, as always there. An emphasis on the extraordinary is deeply revealing for an understanding of fundamental processes in the irrepressible creation of culture, cultural meaning. The infelicitous, the unhappy manner in which persons with mental illness have been regarded as somehow lacking culture. They don't have culture. They're treated in my field, in anthropology, often, they're treated as a footnote or to the side. They're not, you don't have to pay attention to them because they don't have culture. So they're not really very interesting. In fact, people with conditions of mental illness, the afflicted, their kin, their families, their communities, the healers, regularly create an array of meanings attached to their experiences. For example, the examination of extraordinary conditions can reveal cultural processes of anthropomorphosis or personification of pharmaceutical treatment in a complex experiential melange of self medication and illness. You look at the language and people say it, or there's interesting ways of looking also at el otro, la otra, and when you're looking at studies of alterity. In this realm, this is like trying to, like, where's the medication, where's the illness, where's the self? They're all mixed up in this experiential melange, and it's very interesting to look at that. So likewise, this people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia are often considered not even fully gendered. They don't have much in the way of gender or sex drive. They don't have sex lives. This is not true. If you do ethnographic studies and you get to know, how people are living their lives. So in this regard, the book continues my argument that people with extraordinary conditions are just like us, only more so. And the problem gets in with this ironic and, I think, erroneous, it's wrong, kind of quarantine, like setting up a wall or a border that says we're going to have abnormal here and normal here, and we have abnormal psychology. There are courses you can take in abnormal psychology. Then there's normal psychology. This is theoretically, I'm saying, it's untenable. It's empirically untenable. In short, this book is calling out the implicit social and health science tendency to ignore extraordinary, and if we do that, I agree. This is a danger theoretically. So, I have to watch out for this is probably going to be able to do a lot less than I would like to, but I'm going to keep an eye on the time. So what we have right now here I am talking about extraordinary conditions in an era, certainly in the U.S., but it's globalized, an era of neuroscience. Everybody knows this. In the United States, we have public representations every day of mental illness dominated by the pharmaceutical industry, on the one hand, and episodes of deranged gun violence on the other. That's the dominant image, is what's coming through the pharmaceutical industry and what the latest school shooting, and we have one almost every day. So these proliferate cultural studies students in academic texts, newspapers, films, television, magazines, memoirs, pharmaceutical pamphlets, public health billboards, and innumerable internet sites. The New York Times regularly features mental illness as a front page news in relation to recovery, treatment facilities, incarceration. That's what happens in the U.S. Mostly people are in jail. Homelessness, or the denial of care for military veterans. Public health campaigns directed at mental health are increasingly common globally, with slogans such as "Defeat Depression, Spread Happiness" in India, "Chains Free" in Indonesia. And by chains, we mean, people are chained to trees, or una nueva comprensión, una nueva esperanza. That's in Spain. Y el silencio no es salud in Argentina, or better living through chemistry, or a flaw in chemistry, not character, in the United States. These are all culturally inflected in terms of what do we pay attention to, what's going on, what are the billboards, the public health campaigns. But they're going on all over the world now. So this is going on in the context of this era of neuroscience and the idea that everything can be explained by virtue of the brain. And the Obama administration last year announced that they were going to put most of all the money from the National Institute of Health budget into mapping every cell in the human brain. It's a nice project, but it doesn't tell you about real people in real settings with real problems. That's messy, and that's something that we're not going to find out with the Brain Activity Mapping Project, or BAM. And in my view, I am in no way against neuroscience, not at all. I read that, I know that. I even am around because I'm in a school of medicine teaching psychiatry, so I have to know this to some extent. But I think that for studies of mental health, mental illness, this is a question of balance and of prevailing scientific priorities gone awry or not healthy. There is the problem of psychiatric diagnostic categories, which I won't get into. I think I'll just say briefly, there is one anthropologist, Byron Good, whose work I really recommend to students to read. He has a book called medicine, rationality, and experience. And there are various chapters in that book. But one chapter that's really interesting, that's just a short one, which I could send if anyone has interest in it, is on the problem of belief, the nature of belief, and how problematic that is, and how it's really interesting to understand belief not in terms of rationality, but instead in terms of the subjunctive. Everyone who speaks Spanish will understand that, the subjunctive realm of possibilities rather than some fixed idea about belief. So, Byron Good, Byron. I can, yeah.
El libro está en la biblioteca. Bueno, en este momento está en mi currículum, pero después
Yeah. Okay.
estará en la biblioteca próxima.
Okay. So Byron Good, I was giving us a suggestion about some of his work, but he has made an argument that instead of just critiquing psychiatric diagnostic categories like depression, PTSD, and just saying, oh, it's all just junk, to not do that, but to start with those as a point of comparison or description. But then you can move on to critique them, but not to critique them right out of the, without knowing anything. Because there are a lot of people that critique that as well as pharmaceuticals without really knowing too much about what's involved. So he makes that argument. But this is important about psychiatric diagnostic categories, because almost always a person doesn't have one. They could have depression or bipolar illness, but they also have diagnoses of other kinds of problems. So how do you know which one is the most important, or how do you pay attention to it? Well, there's many things going on. And in this way of thinking about multiple kinds of problems, I agree again with Canguilhem's identification of the ontological error in conceptualizing pathology in categorical versus continuous terms. So let me just try and skip over some of this. Just to say that there are a lot of interesting things going on in interpersonal neurobiology, in fields, these are just starting, cultural neuroscience, that is really taking experience seriously, is really taking the environment and adverse conditions seriously, and in relation to brain activities. And there is even someone who is looking at the soul, species-specific creation of the soul, understood as a kind of potentially unique evolutionary adaptation across a range of environments. It's a scholar named Humphrey, and he has this idea of soul niche. Used appropriately, I think these developments can become part of an anthropological toolkit in the quest for a science of things divine, magical, mysterious, and maddening. I want to talk a little bit about culture. Now, in cultural anthropology, the primacy and the particularity of mental illness as a key domain for theorizing culture goes largely unrecognized. I can say it again. In cultural anthropology, not medical so much, cultural anthropology, the primacy of mental illness as a major domain for theorizing culture, excuse me, goes largely unrecognized. So, this is a major problem that I'm concerned with in this book. In biomedical psychiatry, the central importance of culture to the experience and manifestation of mental illness is similarly underappreciated. Cultural anthropologists, ironically, came to be disappointed with the concept of culture, yet enamored of Foucault's biopolitics and technologies of the self. Psychiatrists, ironically, came to think that culture and experience had little or nothing to do with mental illness and became captivated with neuroscience of biogenetics. In the face of this situation, I'm trying to reinsert the importance of the research juncture, anthropology, and psychiatry, looking at these extraordinary conditions of mental illness as providing paradigm cases for fundamental and ordinary processes and capacities of subjectivity. The extraordinary sheds light on the ordinary, from which it diverges, and the edge of experience. By the same token, studies of mental illness shed light on psychopolitical processes or problems of alterity or otherizing in the social rendering of persons diagnosed with mental illness as non-human or less than fully human. Psychiatrists, I worked with a lot of them, many of them are quite wonderful, but they have asked me with the studies I've done, what do you think you're going to find? Do you think that you're going to find that there's anything like a psychological life with these people? These people, who are they? So they are thought to not really have emotion, it's almost like creation of a variety of problematic categories composed of dangerous others: madmen, children, women, savages, foreigners. These societal categories. Ironically, the social stigma attached to mental illness in communities worldwide is only reproduced when cultural anthropologists, and here I am critiquing my own field, relegate such persons and conditions to, as I've said, as best a little more than a footnote, not of relevance to theorizing the structure, function, political, economic, religious, cultural, ecological, symbolic, interpretive, neoliberal, or ethical aspects of indigenous societies, nation states, or global systems. My point is parallel to Virginia Woolf's sense of wonderment in 1935 that illness, quote, has not taken its place with love and battle and jealousy among the prime themes of literature. So in the search for the body and in the search for the mental health and illness, that's what I'm saying. Where is it? What in terms of as a primal theme? After all, experience, following the work of Gadamer, experience is consuming, and health is enigmatic. It's like culture. We assume it's there, no problem, it's there. You only notice if you're sick. It's like, oh, I don't feel very well. It's different, but you have an assumptive world for health and for culture, and these things intertwine in interesting ways, and also in ways that can, as Virginia Woolf talked about, our potential for great spiritual change. So, while in literature there has been extensive treatment of illness and the body, the same cannot be said to be true in cultural anthropology or biomedical psychiatry. Now, let me check the time here. I think I'm just going to try to say a few more things and then just open up for conversation. Well, I said I would say more about culture, and I want to do that. My view of the concept of culture, and there, as we know, and I'd like to hear yours, are many definitions of culture, both inside and outside anthropology and in cultural studies. The critical element is a philosophical and ethnographic approach, in my view, to understanding experience. Culture is not a place, it is not a people, it is not fixed, coherent set of values, behaviors, beliefs, but more an orientation to being in the world that is dynamically created and recreated in the process of social interaction and historical context. I'm going to just repeat that because it was long. I want to say it again. Culture is not, in my opinion, a place nor a people, nor a fixed or coherent set of values, beliefs, behaviors, but more an orientation to being in the world that is dynamically created and recreated in the process of social interaction and historical context. Culture, in my view, has more to do with human processes of attention, perception, and meaning that shape personal and public spheres in a taken for granted manner. What do we pay attention to and how? What matters? What doesn't? What is most remarkable about Homo sapiens is that while cultures we create can be characterized by a remarkable degree of patterning, they can virtually never be described as uniform within a society. They're often rife with idiosyncrasy and individual variation, along with a complexity and diversity and even hyperdiversity within institutional settings. For my purposes, a cultural approach to the extraordinary conditions of mental illness is deeply implicated in the nature of the real or reality. To be precise, reality is culturally constituted, first. Second, reality is inherently in question in the experience of mental illness on the part of those afflicted and their families. What's real? These are the questions that people are concerned with. And third, what is recognized as mental illness or affliction is influenced by culture. In this view, experience is the encounter with the real phenomenon of self, others, and the world as this encounter is lived out in actions and events of everyday life. Subjectivity is the relatively durable structure of experience that is yet subject to transformation based on changing circumstances of modes of engaging the world. A cultural perspective allows identifications of the conditions, social, symbolic, material, subjective. For example, a hammer or an ancestral spirit are equally real. In the case of contemporary medicine, symptom complaints are only considered meaningful if they can be identified as real pathology through objective evidence. I'll just say one more thing and then wrap it up. I do have one other PowerPoint slide I'll whip through too, though. Reality and rationality are inextricably intertwined and linked to culturally and historically specific notions of belief, which apply both in religious and secular contexts. Indeed, there is a close relationship between science, including medicine, and religious fundamentalism that turns in part on this concept of belief that I mentioned in relation to Byron Good. For fundamentalist Christians, salvation follows from belief, and a-religious or non-religious scientists and policymakers see a similar benefit from having a correct belief. So I think that this is probably enough on that of me talking, but let's see. There we go. This is a list. I will go over it very quickly. So I've been telling you an overview of culture being important for mental health. I have two different, I'll come back, there's two different slides here. This is a list of the specific ways that culture shapes mental health, and by the way, and a mental illness, and also its reciprocal mental illness and ideas about and representations of mental illness also shape culture. It's a reciprocal process, but in this case, I really mean that there are at this point many, many decades of empirical studies to show how culture makes a difference in particular ways for these areas, and most particularly important in relation to, as I mentioned at the outset, course and outcome. So I hope I didn't talk too long.
It's great.
Okay. All right. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Bien. Bueno, muchas gracias, Janice. Vamos a tener entonces un tiempo para discusión, para preguntas, comentarios. Si quieren hablar en español, pueden hacerlo, háganlo despacio. ¿Alguien quiere intervenir? Por supuesto, esperaremos unos pocos días antes de conseguir el libro de Janice para que esté en la biblioteca y puedan seguir leyéndolo puedan empezar a leerlo con mayor detenimiento. Mientras tanto, aprovechemos para discutir con la autora.
Sí, cómo no.
No sé si...
Sara, adelante. Por favor, aprovechen para presentarse brevemente y si pueden decir 3 palabras respecto al tema que quieren trabajar ustedes, sería muy útil. Creo que también para Janice será interesante saber cuáles son los temas que ustedes quieren trabajar.
Claro.
¿En español?
Sí, como prefieras.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm working in fat phobia in Mexico. My question is about the concept of engaged depression. Could you say more about that?
Yes. I came to that idea working with a colleague, Marta Valiente, who's from El Salvador, a clinical psychologist, and we were working with Salvadoran persons who were coming to this Latino clinic that I worked at in Boston. And by clinical standards, the women, and the men too, but ended up being more women in the study. The women were depressed according to clinical criteria. Usually, people describe depression as vegetative, as you can't get out of bed, it wipes you out, but in this case, even though these Salvadoran women were clinically depressed, they were working 60 to 80 hours a week, 2 jobs, in efforts to make money to send home to their families. So there was this paradox, or this irony, like, but you're depressed. So the cultural logic that is, I can't work because I'm too depressed. Not in this case. So to describe this, I said this is an engaged kind of depression, because salir adelante, excuse me, to keep going no matter what. That was what was important.
¿Alguien más? Bueno, mi nombre es Anabel, estoy trabajando las prácticas violentas y las estrategias de resistencia dentro de los hospitales de mujeres en México, psiquiátricos. A mí me surge como varias cuestiones. Una por el lado de los fármacos. Tengo entendido que tienen efectos secundarios muy fuertes para los sujetos. Entonces mi pregunta sería, ¿cómo haces entrevistas o cómo te acercas a sujetos que se encuentran en un estado de medicación muy fuerte y pues no sé si tienen como esta limitación de la palabra o de sentirse como...
No estoy segura si entiendo the question exactly, but otra vez.
If the patients are medicated,
Oh.
how you can go and make an interview?
That's what, okay.
Psychological.
Eso es lo que, okay, entendí bien. Okay, that's all right. Okay. What do you mean?
Sí, bueno, yo he trabajado dentro de hospitales psiquiátricos y para mí, con pacientes que se encuentran en un estado de medicación muy fuerte, me ha resultado difícil interactuar con ellos. Me pregunto si podría o si he tenido esta clase de complicaciones.
If I understand what you're saying, that sounds like somebody's very over-medicated. That's impossible. You can't talk to somebody who's over-medicated. They can't speak very well. They can't. That would be very difficult. In that situation of someone very over-medicated, I think they need to rest. You can't do, I mean, you're not going to talk. How do you do it?
No era como, en algún momento la doctora comentó sobre la confusión o la mezcla entre, bueno, el yo, el self, pero la medicación y la condición. Yo creo que a lo mejor tu pregunta puede ser por ahí, o estás hablando de alguien que sí está muy medicado o alguien que sí está medicado, pero ¿cuál es la fiabilidad de los testimonios? Porque ella hablaba de esto, ¿no? De la mezcla entre la medicación, el self y la persona, ¿no? ¿Cómo hacer esta distinción?
Sí, sí, hay momentos en que una persona ha tenido demasiados medicamentos really fuertes. En este caso es muy difícil por lo menos, pero más casi imposible hablar con alguien. Y entrevistas para investigación, no. Tiene que esperar por un momento cuando they feel better para hablar. Se puede hablar.
I think she's asking about
I'm sorry.
when you can actually make the interview, but I think she wants to measure about the capacity of or ethical what you can consider as an information and what not. Because and you said before the melange between self pharmacology and
Yeah. But I'm not sure if that's your question, though. It is. How the ethical question of how if someone's very medicated, that you can look at this melange of these three areas? Okay, well...
What you can consider information and what...
Okay. These are different levels, different questions. The first one would be a methodological and an ethical question regarding when can you interview someone, when can they participate in research. And that has to be when they're well enough to participate and to agree to participate and to understand that they're involved in the research project. That's a different question than the subsequent analysis of data that I had to compile this analysis that thinks about how self and medication and the illness are intermingled as a process of the self. I think that one is an interpretation of all the data later. The other thing you're asking about is about methodological and an ethical question about when and how can you conduct the research in the first place.
Quisiera añadir algo de una conversación anterior que tuvimos con Janis y con el profesor Tom Shordas hace algunos años cuando estábamos comenzando el proyecto de investigación sobre centros de rehabilitación, y yo tenía una preocupación parecida a la de Anabel, en donde yo decía, bueno, ¿a partir de cuándo realmente podemos entrevistar a personas que han estado en un uso constante de sustancias, y a partir de cuándo realmente podemos considerar que son, digamos, los sujetos adecuados para las entrevistas? Y yo les decía mi preocupación en el sentido de, puede haber una gran variación en la narrativa que obtengamos de ellos a partir de entrevistarlos hoy, entrevistarlos dentro de 15 días. Y me acuerdo lo que me respondieron en ese momento, a mí me parece muy claro y probablemente sea un poco en el sentido de lo que estás preguntando. Ellos decían, la variación en la narrativa no es un problema con los datos, ese es el dato. Entonces, yo creo que lo que tienes que pensar es cómo vas a analizar tú lo que estás observando y lo que la gente te está diciendo. ¿Cuál es el sentido que tú tienes que dar en el análisis a la información que estás recibiendo? Entonces, en este caso creo que era muy clara la respuesta de ellos. Si hay una variación, eso no es un problema. Esa es la información que queremos obtener. Entonces, creo que hay que ser muy cuidadosos y muy cautelosos metodológicamente, pero también éticamente, en el sentido de quién realmente podemos nosotros considerar como un sujeto para la entrevista. Seguramente son temas que seguiremos discutiendo el próximo semestre.
Esto es
otra historia.
Could you please talk about your concept of struggle and the difference with resilience?
struggle and
Resiliencia.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. talk about it. It is just that I think my interest in it has to do with the creation of cultural meaning. That what has impressed me doing this work is that people always are struggling to make meaning out of their experience. So if you, whatever the experience is, people are struggling to make meaning. They're struggling to often to get better, to improve. Not always, often, but we do have failures of struggle. It's an interpretive question, but let's say there's suicide. Often there is a big struggle regarding suicide and attempts of suicide. But there is this struggle. But so that's a very complicated personal philosophical issue. But what is impressive is the way that all people, including people who are very disturbed with conditions of mental illness, that they're struggling, like the engaged depression is struggling to go on, to take care of people, often family, to live, to get better, and there's this struggle. It's not something that is linear or constant. It's often incremental, non-linear, and goes back and forth, like in recovery processes. This is very much non-linear, but from the perspective of subjectivity, when you talk to people in a variety of different conditions, they can discern improvement that has to do with resilience, has to do with recovery. They can say, I feel I'm getting better. It's not a straightforward process, but I feel little by little I'm getting better. There might be objective measures to document that, or there might not be. There might be beyond empirical social health sciences capacity to even capture that. So that has to do with improvement. But resilience is the idea that people have a bad thing that happens and they bounce back. But what if you've had a life, your whole life has been a lot of really difficult conditions? How do you bounce back? Then the resilience question is a problem. And we have that in the New Mexico study, where some of these kids have had very difficult lives from very, very early age, lots of traumas, lots of problems. And so we are looking in that case for where is the resilience and where is hope. And it's not as easy to see as it has been with the Salvadorans that I've worked with, for example. But I'm not so sure that it's absent, but that maybe it's disguised because maybe it's dangerous to hope. So at that level, I think you have to have a psychological understanding that people do things to protect themselves. They have processes, psychopolitical processes to protect themselves when it's not safe. We all know this from our own personal experience, but that's part of what I'm trying to think about, resilience in relation to those things and then beyond that.
Hi, my name is Hector Miguel Corral. Well, I work in issues related to bareback sex and as an expression of political autonomy. And well, I was wondering that, well, usually the mental realm is seen as a dichotomy in the illness and health. And well, speaking about it or addressing it as a extraordinary condition or extraordinary experience is a wide way to consider it, the question. And I was wondering if in this context, do you integrate or how do you articulate the perspective of human rights with these persons?
Well, I think that the question of human rights is central to, and I do talk about that in the book, it's central to the problem that a lot of times people in these situations or in these conditions are not, they don't have the same political status or human rights. So, as a matter of sexuality or sexual practices, then that's a complicated situation. What do you think? Let me ask you, Hector. What do you think that the mental health issues might be in relation to that? And I ask you that because I have a student who finished his PhD recently on HIV positive men who have sex with men who are also very regularly using methamphetamine, and he did life histories with them. He's about 21 men, and found some very interesting things about their biographies and their mental health status that I often don't hear about in these kinds of studies. So, what is your research experience?
Well, I actually haven't started like the work.
Okay.
I mean, like the empirical work, but I do have reflections about it. But at first place, I believe that people have the right to decide what to do with their body, with their life, that without a shadow of a doubt. The other is that, well, it's because I think about it more like in the way that historically, yes, well, actually, I'm thinking about the conception of Homo sacer that from Agamben, and he talks about that how can possibly human being sacrificed in the institutional system. And well, I believe that it is a problematic approach when a person, the subject, do not adjust to the norm or to the institution, and it immediately it's a condition of exclusion for it, for that person. And actually, what I'm actually trying to say is that even though people take decisions about even risk decisions about themselves, they do have the right to take those decisions. And related to human rights, I do believe that it is a very prominent right to let these persons express themselves as the way they think. And if you link that with a political position, it becomes more complex, but it gives more tools to explain the complexity of that phenomena. I'm not sure if I do have a point.
I think so. I think it's very complicated, as you've said, but it's complicated also in relation to this idea of choice. So people can be free to do what they want. I agree with you. But making problematic this choice, what is it? Where does that come from? And but being stigmatized for a choice, leaving that aside, how does that happen? I think it's a complicated process, the choice. But once that's made, what happens? What are the consequences, the social consequences? For people making socially stigmatizing comments in the context of they don't know anything about a given individual or group of individuals. They may know nothing about it, right? It's just the social stigma. So, but that's what I'm intending to say is that I think all realms of human experience are very intricate and very complex, and that is certainly yet another area to look at. And I don't know if you would be interested in this dissertation that I mentioned, but if you are, I can put you in touch with, his name is Ted Gideonsey, and he was at UCSD, but he finished his PhD and now has a postdoc position at UCLA, and you might be interested in some of his work.
Sure, that'll be great.
Yeah.
¿Otra pregunta?
¿Alguien más?
Yo tengo una pregunta,
Okay.
Janice, pero es una...
Sí.
Sí, con respecto a lo que comentabas, Jani, sobre no hay reconocimiento a los derechos a ejercer su sexualidad en estas personas. Me gustaría como... quisiera que si pudieras profundizar un poco en esta parte de que no hay reconocimiento al ejercicio de su sexualidad sin que sean infantilizados. Regularmente parece que esta gente no tiene vida sexual o no tiene deseo, y eso es un mito por un lado, pero también me gustaría, no sé si lo pudieras relacionar con cosas que no tienen solamente que ver con la práctica sexual, sino también con el género, ¿no? Esta, no sé si tú conoces la campaña de Stop Trans Pathologization, que es una campaña internacional contra la patologización del trastorno de identidad de género, que es como se denomina disforia de género. Entonces me gustaría saber cómo abundar un poquito en este sentido, si tú trabajas eso, si piensas en eso, y sobre todo lo de la sexualidad.
That's another complicated question. Well, part of the mito of that people who have serious conditions of mental illness, don't have sexual desire, I think that historically is rooted in eugenics projects, that people who are damaged should not reproduce. So they are not encouraged by healthcare providers, doctors, to have relationships, to have sex, to be normal. That's not what really happens, but so they hide it. And so I think that there are all of these myths and stereotypes about the mentally ill and who they are and what that's one thing. But the gender identity is complicated. In one study that is in the book, of 90 people that we had who had some kind of psychotic related illness, about 1/5 or 20% of them had significant gender confusion. They thought at different times, they don't know if they're a man or a woman. So it comes and goes. I don't think that's unusual. I think that maybe most people don't have that. A lot of people do. So that it's like, I think that is exactly why I think it's interesting and important to study people with what I'm calling extraordinary experience or mental problems with mental illness, because you learn about the full panorama of humans for gender, for what's possible in terms of emotion, what's possible in terms of gender identity, what's possible. And the thing is, many things are possible. Many things are possible for humans. And you have, and some of the people I worked with have had gender, there are people who are transgendered, there are people who have had gender confusion. I don't know that that has anything to do with mental illness. I don't think so. I think that it's a human possibility.
Pero está en el manual, ¿no?
Sí.
En el DSM-4, ahora en el DSM-5.
Yeah, they have a lot of offensive, problematic things there, yeah.
Hay mucha moral en ese manual.
Yeah, definitely.
Bueno, ¿alguien más?
Hi, my name is Sofia, and I'm working with work identity, and journalists from San Diego and Tijuana.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to
Work identity.
work identities, or
Interesting.
professional identities.
Interesting.
Thank you. Also, sexual interest or the meaning of the sexuality in persons that suffer this. Is there a concern about job or being productive in these persons, or how does the work help to recover?
That's a really good question, and I have that in my book. I think that it can help a lot having a job and working to recover. However, again, going back to the question that Hector raised, there is the problem that can be related, depending on persons and categories of persons, in relation to social stigma. So people have this dilemma if they have a serious problem with mental health, about whether to tell their employers or not. And in my research experience, people have told, sometimes they thought they get along very well with their employer or even somebody that's interviewing them for a job. So they tell them, and that's the end of it. They never hear back that they got the job, or they get fired, let go from their jobs. So this decision to tell someone that you have a mental illness is, you cannot just say, well, you know, you should just, everybody should just act up and have the human right to do that. You can do that, and we should do that, but there are real consequences to it that people need to be aware of as possibilities. So it's complicated. What has to happen at a level of public consciousness and health is people need to be educated about what persons who have difficulties with mental health, who they really are, what the problems are, because it's mostly consists of fears and stereotypes and very negative things. So, you know, I mean, it's only, I think, a little more difficult in the U.S. than here, right on this side of the border, to get a job if you have tattoos. If you have tattoos, that's another kind of stigma that employers.
Actually, in the airports also.
Yeah, in the airports too. Yeah.
And the color of the skin.
Oh, the color of the skin. No.
Everything together is a mess.
Yes.
¿Algún micrófono?
Se está transmitiendo, ¿no?
Hi. You were talking in a moment about how mental illness is not an individual problem, and how young people was diagnosed with mental illness, but it was actually a problem about structural violence. And I was thinking how problematic it is to involve that context in the treatment process. I mean, like family and the social conditions. And I was thinking about if you work with that, I mean, the treatment process, how to involve cultural conditions or social conditions, family, work in that process.
Well, at a minimum, I think that in the treatment process, people who are providing treatment need to know what the conditions are that the people they're treating, what of their lives. A lot of times what happens in treatment is that people put blinders on. I only want to know about these symptoms and this one illness or this one substance abuse problem, and that's it. I can't know about anything else because there's nothing I can do about it. That's a clinical attitude. Not very helpful, because while there really are limits on clinical or treatment time, an understanding, a basic understanding of a bigger picture, I think, is far more helpful than not having it. But it's difficult. Some treatment teams have this kind of theoretical integration very well developed in what they do. For example, Partners in Health, if you have ever heard of them, they are like, they've been around less time, but like Doctors Without Borders, and they have a bigger picture of structural violence and what's the cause of, say, a cholera outbreak in Haiti or gun violence in the United States as social and political epidemics and not natural disasters, because the history and the politics of how resources get allocated. But I understand that for people providing treatment, this is kind of can be a lot to take in. But I think that it's possible, and depends on training programs and treatment programs and how people think about problems and how they talk about it. And if it's always just as one individual right in front of you, unconnected to a family or a community or a neighborhood, it's pretty limited. Not impossible or terrible, but just limited.
Otra pregunta? I have a question, Janice. Mine is not a difficult question. It's more anecdotal about writing a book. And I would like to ask you, you very well explained how there are different views, this brain-centered idea of mental illness and this cultural approach. And I would like to ask you, when you were writing this book, who were you thinking about as your public, and how you build dialogue between those so different perspectives about experience and mental illness?
Yes, well, I think that the intended audience is people, hopefully it's written clearly enough that anyone could read it. But it's intended for the health sciences and for social sciences, but particularly anthropology and psychiatry. And so, since I've been in both of those worlds for a very long time, some of my intended audience definitely are neuroscientists. Some of them actually will read this. Some of them won't be able to escape me in various ways. A lot of them will ignore it entirely. That's a given. But my intended audience is both. So how to keep all this in mind? Well, I think the honest answer, Olga, is I don't know that I did all the time, because some of the work, some of the chapters will appeal more to anthropologists. For example, there's a chapter on religion and mental health in relation to the Salvadoran women that I worked with. And I'm sure that many people in the health sciences would say, why is this even here? Why do we need this? And my point is that to understand culture and mental health, you have to understand religion too. Why? Because it's important to the persons that I work with. I'm not a specialist in religion, but it was very clear that it was important to them. So it's definitely anthropological in the sense that what we do as anthropologists is we are always trying at one level to get at what understanding the world and experience from the perspective of the people we're working with. You know this. We know this. Olga does this in all of her work. So this is what we're doing. But I've been interdisciplinary for so long. I think that I have all these. I'm not going to say I have voices in my head. I don't actually, but I don't know if this book would have gone on too much longer, maybe. But just these different communities. So I didn't have a real specific strategy. We'll see how it goes, but it's a good question. People did ask me that. I don't know that I have a great answer for it.
I just have a comment that if you find different ways that the people confront this extraordinary condition, according with their cultural background different. If there are maybe another kind of treatments that is not the dominant treatment in a psychiatric center, there are different kind of alternative therapies, treatments in
Yes.
the population.
Yes. In the work that I've done, I think that people tend to be very polymorphously seeking. They'll seek healing from a variety of places, not just biomedicine, not just psychopharmaceuticals, but indigenous healing, like the kind of work that you've done, Olga. Definitely, people that I've worked with have also sought help from curanderos or curanderas, and usually they do both. It's not one or the other, although sometimes it flips back and forth. So like, let's say the curandera doesn't really help, so then they go to a medical doctor. The medical doctor doesn't help, so then you say, okay, I'm going to go to or in the case of the Salvadoran women, it was more espiritismo, and this is in Boston, and espiritistas, algunos santeros, and they would go to centros, and of course, you know, very, very important for healing is as a matter of subjectivity, is religion in terms of relationships to, I'm thinking of the Salvadorans, Divina Providencia, the certain saints, Virgen, that are, they're part of their lives, you know, this is everyday life, that how they heal, how they live. So, and sometimes people would go to healers in relation to that, and sometimes not. That's just their own way of thinking and being in the world. Okay, all right.
Si no hay ninguna otra pregunta, ¿hay alguna otra o ya está? ¿No? Bueno, si no hay ninguna otra pregunta, pues muchas gracias, doctora Jenkins. Vamos a proceder a darle una constancia por haber participado con nosotros el día de hoy. Y nice. Bueno, el Colegio de la Frontera Norte otorga la presente constancia a Janice H. Jenkins por su participación con la conferencia magistral Extraordinary Conditions, Mental Illness as Experience, en el marco de la celebración de los 30 años del posgrado en COLEF, realizado el día de hoy, el 17 de diciembre de 2014, en la ciudad de Tijuana, Baja California. Muchas gracias y esperemos que nos vuelvas a acompañar pronto. Gracias. Gracias.